What if the man everyone feared was the only one who would treat her with kindness? 6 months before Rachel Brooks stood inside a warm log cabin, watching a giant mountain man carve a tiny wooden cradle with his rough hands, she had been alone, cold, and unwanted in the town of Millbrook. The cradle, smooth and beautifully carved with little roses, glowed in the firelight. Rachel placed a hand on her belly and felt the baby move. Tears filled her eyes because she finally understood that Brian Jones, the man the whole town feared, had been making this cradle for her child, a child that wasn't even his. But everything had started the day Rachel arrived in Millbrook, with only a worn carpet bag, $17, and a growing belly she could no longer hide. Rachel stepped off the stagecoach on a chilly evening. The coach left in a cloud of dust before she even gathered her thoughts, leaving her stranded in a town where she knew no one. Her loose dress could no longer hide her condition, and she saw the way people stared at her. Men looked with judgment. Women whispered behind hands. Children were pulled away from her as if she carried some kind of sickness. She had come west because of promises made by a man who had lied to her. A man who walked out on her the minute he learned she was expecting his child. Now she was alone and pregnant in a cold place where no one cared for a stranger, especially one like her. Rachel tried to get a room at the town boarding house. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, looked her up and down with tight lips and hard eyes. "No respectable place will house a woman in your situation," she said. Rachel stood frozen while the door was shut in her face. By nightfall, she sat alone on a bench outside the general store, hungry, cold, and terrified of what tomorrow would bring. The mountains surrounding the valley felt like walls closing in on her life. She wrapped her thin shawl tighter and prayed quietly for help. That was when she saw him. Brian Jones stepped out of the dark, like a shadow pulled out of the mountain itself. Nearly 7 feet tall, broad as a barn door, dressed in animal hides, with a thick beard and sharp eyes. He moved like a man who belonged to the wild. When he walked down the street, people scattered. Mothers grabbed their children. Men stepped out of his path. Rachel had already heard the whispers about him earlier that day. That man killed his own brother. Dangerous, wild, lives alone. Don't even look at him. Her heart pounded as he came closer, but she did not look away. Something in the way he walked, steady, calm, almost careful, did not match the scary stories. He stopped a few feet from her and studied her face, then her bag, then her belly. His dark eyes did not show disgust, only concern. "You need shelter," he said in a low voice that sounded strong but gentle. It wasn't a question. Rachel stared at him. The entire town feared him, but in that moment, he was the only person who had spoken to her with kindness. She gave the smallest nod. Brian turned and began walking toward the edge of town. He only stopped once to check if she was following. Rachel grabbed her bag and hurried after him, unsure if she had just made the best or worst choice of her life. The path up the mountain was long and rough. They walked for 3 hours through the dark. Brian helped her climb over rocks when the trail got steep, but he never touched her without waiting for her to accept his hand. The forest sounds filled the silence. Owls calling, leaves moving, the distant cry of wolves. By the time they reached his cabin, Rachel's feet and back ached, and she was shivering from the cold. The cabin surprised her. It was not a dirty shack like she imagined. It was large, built from strong logs, with warm yellow light glowing through the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. Brian's home looked safe. Inside, the cabin was tidy and comfortable. A stone fireplace warmed the room. There were shelves filled with books, wooden carvings, and handmade furniture. Animal pelts covered the floor like soft rugs. "You can have the bed," Brian said, pointing to a soft sleeping area behind a curtain. "I'll sleep by the fire." Rachel tried to argue, but he raised a hand gently. "You need rest, especially in weather like this." Quote. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin and snow blew against the windows. Inside, it felt like a different world, warm and safe. That night, Rachel listened to Brian move quietly as he banked the fire and secured the door. She fell asleep to the steady sound of his breathing, something that felt strangely comforting. It was the first night in a long time she didn't feel scared. The next morning, the smell of coffee and bacon woke her. Brian had made breakfast and placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the table. The small gesture hit her heart harder than anything she had felt in months. As days passed, a gentle routine formed. Brian hunted and checked traps. Rachel cleaned and made the place cozy. In the evenings, they read by the fire. Brian's deep voice made the books come alive. He treated her with respect. He never asked about the baby's father and never judged her. Slowly, she began to see the truth. Brian was not a monster. He was a lonely man who had been hurt by lies and pushed away by cruel gossip. The town feared him without knowing him, and Rachel began to wonder if she had found a place where she and her baby finally belonged. Rachel soon learned that life on the mountain was peaceful, but it was not simple. Winter settled over the land like a heavy blanket, making travel difficult and turning every chore into a challenge. Still, the cabin felt warmer than any home Rachel had known. Brian was patient, thoughtful, and protective in a way she had never experienced. He checked the traps closer to the cabin now, unwilling to leave her alone for long. He came back each day with meat or firewood, brushing snow from his shoulders before stepping inside with a soft smile that felt like sunlight after a storm. Rachel found comfort in caring for the cabin. She cleaned, cooked, and sewed baby clothes from soft fabric Brian brought from town. She felt useful again, instead of like a burden everyone wished would disappear. At night, she sat by the fire and stitched tiny shirts and blankets while Brian carved small wooden toys. He never said the words out loud, but each toy felt like a promise that her baby would be wanted. One evening as they sat together, Rachel gathered the courage to ask the question that had been sitting in her heart. "Brian, what really happened with your brother?" Quote. Brian placed the carving tool down and stared into the fire. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. Then, in a quiet, steady voice, he told her the truth. He hadn't killed his brother. They had argued over their father's farm before his brother Jerry left for California to search for gold. People assumed the worst, and rumors grew into a story full of lies. Brian had been too hurt to defend himself, so he left for the mountains, choosing peace over trying to prove his innocence to people who never cared for the truth. Hearing his story made Rachel's heart ache. The town had judged him the way they had judged her, without knowing anything, without wanting to know. "You're not the man they think you are," Rachel said quietly. Brian looked at her with a softness she had never seen in his eyes. "Neither are you." Quote. From that night forward, something changed between them. Their glances lasted a little longer. Their conversations grew a little deeper. They laughed more often. The cabin no longer felt like a place she was visiting. It felt like her home. But the world beyond the mountain was never far. The first time they returned to town together, heads turned, whispers started, and Rachel felt all eyes on her like sharp needles. But she held her head high. This time she wasn't alone. Brian walked beside her, tall and calm, his presence a shield against every judging stare. He stood close, not touching her but making it clear she was under his protection. They gathered supplies quietly. But as they walked toward the door, Rachel overheard a woman whisper, "Poor thing, living up there with that man. What kind of life is that for her and that baby?" Quote. Rachel wanted to run, but Brian gently placed his hand on her back, guiding her out before she could react. His touch held no force, just quiet support. Outside, she let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. "They don't know you," Rachel said. "They don't see the man I see." Brian looked down at her, and for a moment she saw a little hope in his eyes. As the months passed, Rachel's belly grew, and so did her bond with Brian. He stayed closer every day, watching over her more carefully as her due date neared. Some nights she woke to find him sitting by the fire, carving something with great care. He always hid it away when she got up, never letting her see what he was making. One morning after a powerful snowstorm, she woke to silence in the cabin. Brian wasn't by the fire. Panic rose in her throat. She called his name and followed the faint sound of cutting wood. When she peeked through the workshop door, she froze. Brian stood with his back to her, his large hands moving with such gentleness it made tears fill her eyes. He was carving a wooden cradle, the same cradle she would see finished months later. He smoothed the curved edges with careful strokes, adding small rose carvings along the headboard. He had lined the inside with soft rabbit fur. The wood looked warm in the morning light, almost glowing. Rachel covered her mouth to keep from making a sound. He had been working on this for weeks. For her baby. For a child that wasn't even his. She stepped away before he saw her and sat by the fire, overcome with emotion. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe this mountain wasn't just a place to hide. Maybe it was where she and her baby were meant to belong. That evening, she finally asked the question she feared the most. "Brian," she said softly, "when the baby comes, do you want us to stay here, or will you want us to leave?" Brian stopped mending his shirt and stared at the fire. His jaw tightened as if the words hurt him. When he spoke, his voice was low and full of feeling. "Rachel, I've been alone a long time. This cabin, it wasn't a home until you came. If you and the baby want to stay, I'd be honored. I don't want you to leave. Not now, not ever." Her breath caught. Tears filled her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt wanted. Not tolerated. Wanted. "Yes," she whispered. "We want to stay." Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, a new kind of warmth grew between them, a warmth that felt like family, like love, like a future. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. Spring sunlight melted the snow on the mountain, and with it came the day Rachel went into labor. She had been hanging laundry outside when a sharp pain gripped her belly. Brian was close by and ran to her the moment he heard her gasp. His calm voice and steady hands guided her back to the cabin. The hours that followed were long and painful, but Brian stayed by her side, doing everything he could to help. He boiled water, held her hand when she needed strength, and whispered encouragement in his deep, steady voice. By the next afternoon, the cries of a newborn baby filled the cabin. A healthy baby girl with dark hair and a strong voice came into the world. Brian held her first, his large hands trembling as if he feared he might break her. He placed the baby gently into Rachel's arms. "She's beautiful," he said. "Perfect, just like her mother." Rachel named her Victoria after her grandmother, but Brian softly added, "Victoria Watson-Jones." And Rachel's heart nearly burst. He wanted to give the baby his name, his family, his life. And she wanted that too. Their small cabin was now a home. A family had been born on that mountain. Weeks passed, filled with sleepless nights and joyful mornings. Brian made wooden toys and sang deep, soft songs that always seemed to calm Victoria. Rachel often watched him with their daughter, amazed that this gentleman was the same one the town spoke so cruelly about. When she saw him place Victoria in the cradle he had built with his own hands, she felt a peace that she had never known before. But peace in town did not come so easily. Their first trip to Millbrook with baby Victoria caused a stir. People stared as Brian held the baby with such care. Mrs. Henderson, the very woman who had turned Rachel away months earlier, walked up to them. She stared at the sleeping baby, then at Brian. "She's a lovely child," she said, softer than Rachel had ever heard her speak. "I may have been wrong about you." That small change gave Rachel hope, but not everyone felt the same. Matthew White, a wealthy rancher who believed he ran the town, had watched Rachel since the day she arrived. He did not like seeing her with Brian. One afternoon in town, while Brian stayed at the cabin with Victoria, White cornered Rachel outside the post office. His eyes were full of anger and something meaner. "You're wasting your life up there," he said. "Come work for me. I'll give you a proper life. The child deserves better than a mountain man for a father." Rachel stepped back, but he grabbed her arm. His grip hurt. Fear rose in her chest, and she tried to pull away. Before she could speak, a calm but cold voice cut through the air. The lady said, "Let go." Brian stood behind them, Victoria strapped to his chest in a sling. His eyes were sharp as icy water. White released Rachel immediately but tried to hold on to his pride. "This isn't over," he said, but the look in Brian's eyes promised that he would protect his family at any cost. Summer came and the mountain flowers bloomed bright and strong. One night, after weeks of White's whispers and rude stares in town, Rachel made a decision. She turned to Brian as they lay near the cradle and said the words that stunned him. "Brian, will you marry me?" The silence that followed was full of emotion. Brian sat up, shocked. "Rachel, are you sure?" Quote. She took his hand. "You have given me more love and safety than anyone ever has. You are the father Victoria deserves. You are the man I want to marry." Brian placed his forehead to hers. "Yes, Rachel, I will marry you. I will be a husband you can be proud of, and a father Victoria can look up to." 3 weeks later, they married in the cabin. The traveling preacher spoke the vows while Victoria slept in Brian's arms. There were no guests, no flowers, no music, but it was perfect. When the preacher left, Rachel and Brian shared a quiet kiss filled with love and promise. Life finally felt safe. But White's anger grew. He could not stand that Rachel had chosen Brian. One snowy night, while Brian and his visiting brother Jerry were helping a neighbor, White came to the cabin with 2 men. He threatened Rachel, broke their window, and told her he would take Victoria away. Rachel grabbed Brian's rifle and warned him to leave. Her voice shook, but her aim did not. White left, but he wasn't done. The final moment came weeks later. Brian was outside splitting wood when White stumbled up the trail alone, drunk and furious. He pulled a gun and pointed it at Brian. Before he could fire, Jerry stepped from the trees and shot White in the shoulder, stopping him. Even after everything, Brian refused to leave White to die. They took him to town for the doctor, and everyone learned the truth of what had happened. The town finally saw who Brian really was. A good man. White was arrested and removed from Millbrook. The danger was gone. After that day, everything changed. People greeted them with warmth. Rachel was invited to socials. Brian was asked to help with projects and became respected for his quiet strength. Victoria grew surrounded by love. Jerry bought a ranch nearby so he could stay close. Months later, on a warm evening, Rachel sat on the porch with Brian and Victoria. She rested her hand on her belly, carrying their second child. She looked at the cradle inside the cabin and smiled. Brian turned to her. "Do you ever wish life had gone differently?" Rachel leaned her head against his shoulder. "No. Because every hard day led me here, to you, to our children, to this home. The man nobody wanted had become the husband everyone admired. And Rachel, once alone and ashamed, had found a love strong enough to build a family, a future, and a life she never dreamed she'd have."